Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. In today's video, I'm going to tell you 7 true scary stories that happened in the Appalachian Mountains during October. These stories are so creepy, they'll make you never want to go into those mountains, especially in October. But before we start, please hit that subscribe button and don't forget to give this video a like. Share it with your friends who love scary stories. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks to everyone for watching. Alright, let's get into these scary October stories. I was 19 when I started babysitting to help pay for community college. Eastern Kentucky isn't exactly loaded with opportunities, and watching kids for $20 a night was easy money compared to the factory work most people my age were doing. I'd grown up in Pineville, so I knew most of the families around here, but the Morrisons were new to the area. They'd bought that old farmhouse about 8 miles outside town, the one that sits by itself in all those thick woods with no neighbors for miles. The house had been empty for years before they moved in. I remember driving past it as a kid and thinking it looked like something out of a movie. White paint peeling off the siding, shutters hanging crooked, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean in too close. But the Morrisons had fixed it up nice. Fresh paint, new roof, even put in a decent driveway. They seemed like good people too. He worked remote for some tech company. She was a nurse at the hospital in town, and their daughter Sophie was about the sweetest 4-year-old you could imagine. They called me on October 28th, asking if I could watch Sophie that Saturday night while they went to a Halloween party. I said sure, I needed the money, and Sophie was always well behaved. Easy job. They told me they'd probably be back around midnight, left me their cell numbers, showed me where everything was in the house. Standard stuff. Sophie was excited about Halloween, talking my ear off about her costume and trick-or-treating plans. But she kept mentioning her October friend who was coming to visit. At first I thought she meant another kid from town, maybe someone she was going to go trick-or-treating with. But when I asked her about it, she got this serious look on her face and said her October friend only came once a year, always in October, and they played special games together. Her parents just laughed it off when I mentioned it. Kids and their imaginary friends, Mrs. Morrison said, grabbing her purse. She's been talking about this October friend for weeks. Don't worry about it. Mr. Morrison nodded, adjusting his tie. Sophie has quite the imagination. She'll probably forget all about it once you two start playing. They left around 7:30, and that's when things started feeling off. The temperature in the house dropped. I'm not talking about a little chill. I mean, it felt like someone had cranked the air conditioning down 15 degrees in the span of maybe 10 minutes. I checked the thermostat, thinking maybe the Morrisons had it programmed weird, but it was set to 72 and showed it was 72. Yet I could see my breath when I exhaled. Sophie ran to the living room window and started waving at something outside. "She's here," she said, jumping up and down. "My October friend is here." I looked out the window, but couldn't see anything except darkness and trees swaying in the wind. No car headlights, no people walking around, nothing. "Where is she, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Right there." Sophie pointed at what looked like empty space near the tree line. "Can't you see her?" She's waving back at me. Sophie started having full conversations with thin air. Not the kind of pretend play kids usually do, where they're obviously making it up as they go along. This was different. She'd ask questions and then pause, like she was listening to answers. She'd giggle at things I couldn't hear, and nod her head like someone was explaining something to her. "What's your friend telling you?" I asked, sitting down beside her. "She says she's been waiting all year to see me again," Sophie said without taking her eyes off the window. "She says we're going to play our special game tonight." That's when I heard the footsteps upstairs. Not heavy footsteps like an adult walking around, light ones like a child running. But the Morrisons had told me Sophie was an only child, and there was nobody else in the house. I grabbed Sophie's hand. "Come on, let's go check something out." We went upstairs to Sophie's room, and that's where I saw the scratches. They were carved into the wooden wall beside her bed. Deep scratches, like someone had used a knife or something sharp to mark them. They were arranged in groups of 5, the way you'd count things. I counted them twice to make sure. 23 marks total. "That's how she counts," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "1 mark for every year she visits me." My stomach dropped. Sophie was 4 years old. These marks looked old, weathered, Some of them had been there for years, maybe decades. "How long has your friend been visiting you, Sophie?" "Forever," she said. "She told me she's been coming to this house way before I was born. She's been waiting for someone like me." Sophie wanted to play hide and seek. She said her October friend loved that game. I figured it was harmless enough, might even help distract her from whatever was going on in her imagination. But when Sophie ran off to hide, I heard 2 sets of footsteps, light, quick steps moving through the house. One set I could follow, Sophie giggling as she found her hiding spot. The other set moved differently, like someone was searching methodically through each room. "Ready or not, here I come," I called out. 2 voices answered. Sophie's sweet 4-year-old voice saying, "Find me," and another voice, sounding exactly like Sophie's but older somehow, deeper, like what Sophie might sound like when she was 8 or 9 years old. I found Sophie hiding behind the couch in the living room. She was alone, but I definitely heard 2 voices answer me. "Did you hear your friend talking?" I asked her. "She's really good at hide and seek," Sophie said. "She knows all the best hiding spots in this house." I started looking through family photos on the mantelpiece, just trying to ground myself in something normal. The Morrisons had pictures from when they first moved in, some from Sophie's birthday parties, holiday photos. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the Halloween photos from last year, Sophie looked older, not a little older like kids do when they grow up. I mean, she looked like she was 8 or 9 years old. Taller, longer face, different proportions entirely. But in the Christmas photos from just 2 months later, she was back to looking like a 4-year-old. I pulled out more photos, going through them systematically. Every October, Sophie aged up dramatically in the pictures. Every November, she was small again. "Sophie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "How old are you?" "4," she said. But then she tilted her head like she was listening to something. "My October friend says I'm older than that. She says, I just don't remember being older." That's when I understood what was happening. The October friend wasn't imaginary. And she wasn't just any entity or spirit. She was Sophie. An older version of Sophie that existed only in October, feeding off the years of Sophie's life. The entity was stealing time from her, aging her up for 1 month each year and then snapping her back, keeping those stolen years for itself. Sophie wasn't aging normally. Something was harvesting her childhood, 1 October at a time. At 11 p.m., Sophie started changing. Her face began stretching, subtle at first, then more dramatically. Her limbs got longer, her voice deeper. But instead of looking happy about it like a kid playing dress-up, she looked terrified. "She's taking me again," Sophie said, but her voice was changing as she spoke, getting older with each word. "Please don't let her take me. I don't want to go." I could see the older Sophie now. She materialized near the window, reaching out with hands that looked ancient, withered. She was probably 8 or 9 years old physically, but her eyes looked like they'd seen decades of Octobers. The life force was being pulled out of young Sophie like luminous threads, visible streams of light flowing from her body to the older version. The older Sophie snarled when she saw me interfering. "You're interrupting the harvest," she said in a voice that was Sophie's but wrong, like an old recording played at the wrong speed. "She belongs to me. They all belong to me." I grabbed young Sophie and held her tight, feeling those threads trying to pull her away from me. The older version turned her attention to me then, and I felt my own life being drained. I could feel myself aging rapidly, my skin tightening, my hair getting brittle. But I wasn't going to let go of that child. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and started cutting at the luminous threads connecting the 2 Sophies. Each cut sent shockwaves through both of them, but I kept cutting until the connection severed completely. The older Sophie shrieked and started dissolving, but not before she looked right at me and said, "There are others. So many others. This house has fed me for 80 years. Sophie snapped back to her normal size instantly, crying and confused. She didn't remember most of what had happened, just that she'd been scared and I'd helped her. When the Morrisons came home around midnight, they found their house trashed, furniture overturned, and Sophie clinging to me in the corner of the living room. I told them there'd been an incident, that Sophie had gotten scared, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what really happened. They took one look at their daughter's terrified face and my shaken state, and didn't ask too many questions. They moved out the following week, just packed up and left without much explanation to anyone in town. I never told them what I'd learned about their house, but I think they suspected something wasn't right. I did some research after they left. County records showed 23 different families had lived in that house over the past 80 years. All of them had young children. All of them moved away suddenly after October, or their children died or disappeared on Halloween night. 23 families, 23 scratches on Sophie's bedroom wall. I still babysit, but I don't take jobs in October anymore. And I've never driven past that farmhouse again, even though it's the shortest route to several places I need to go. I take the long way around now. Some houses should stay empty. To this day, I wonder how many other October friends are out there, waiting in other houses, marking other walls, stealing other childhoods one harvest at a time. I was 22 when I took the night shift cleaning job at Mercy General Hospital up in the Virginia mountains. This was October of last year, and I needed the money after dropping out of college. My dad had gotten laid off from the mine, and someone had to help with bills. The hospital had been serving these mountain communities since 1923, but most of it sat empty now, except for the emergency department and a couple wings still running. The day crew kept making jokes about October being different up here, how things got restless when the leaves started turning. I figured it was just mountain superstition, AD. You know how folks in these hollers can get about old stories. But Mrs. Henderson, who'd worked there since the 60s, pulled me aside my first day. She didn't say much, just looked at me real serious and said, "Boy, if something don't feel right after midnight, you trust that feeling." Then she walked away before I could ask what she meant. My shift ran 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., cleaning 3 floors of mostly vacant rooms. The old pediatric ward on the 3rd floor had been closed since 1978, but it still needed maintenance to keep the dust down. The maternity ward on the 2nd floor was the same way. Empty rooms with outdated equipment covered in sheets, like someone had just stepped out and forgot to come back. October 29th was my first real night alone in there. I started on the 3rd floor around 10:30, pushing my cart down those long hallways lined with empty rooms. That's when I first heard it. Children singing nursery rhymes somewhere in the distance. Not loud, just faint enough that I kept stopping to listen, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The singing would stop whenever I tried to follow it. I'd stand there in the hallway, cleaning supplies rattling softly in my cart, listening to nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights. 5 minutes later, it would start up again from the opposite direction. Ring Around the Rosie, London Bridge, songs I remembered from when I was little. After about an hour, I found toys scattered across a floor I'd already mopped, little plastic blocks spelling out words I couldn't make sense of. A stuffed rabbit sitting upright in the middle of an empty room, facing the wall. Crayons arranged in perfect circles on windowsills. I gathered them up and locked them in the supply closet, but the next night they were back, arranged differently. The elevator started acting up my 3rd night. This old thing from the 60s would ding open and shut by itself, always stopping at the 2nd floor. I'd hear those doors slide open with that mechanical grinding sound, pause for maybe 30 seconds, then grind shut again. All night long, every 20 minutes or so. I reported it to maintenance, but they said the elevator was working fine during day shifts. That's when I started finding the handprints. Small ones, pressed against the inside of windows I'd just cleaned. Always on the 3rd floor, always appearing after I'd finished a room and moved on. When I came back to check, there they'd be tiny palm prints and finger smudges fogging up the glass like someone had breathed on it and pressed their hands against the window from inside the room. I tried taking pictures, but my phone camera wouldn't focus right. Every photo came out blurry or too dark, like there was something wrong with the light in those rooms. The pictures I took during the day came out fine. The building felt different after midnight, heavier. The air would get thick like before a storm, and I'd find myself breathing harder even though I wasn't doing anything strenuous. Temperature would drop enough that I could see my breath, but only in certain rooms. The heating system worked fine everywhere else. I started hearing footsteps in empty hallways, slow, deliberate steps that echoed off the walls. They'd stop the moment I tried to investigate, leaving me standing alone in the corridor with my heart pounding and the taste of metal in my mouth. Sometimes I'd hear doors opening and closing, but when I checked, all the rooms were still locked. Curiosity got the better of me, so I spent some time digging through old hospital records in the basement. What I found made my skin crawl. From 1,923 to 1,978, there were these unexplained child deaths every Halloween night. Healthy kids brought in for routine procedures would just stop. Heart failure, the report said, but the symptoms didn't match anything the doctors recognized. The nursing notes were worse. Staff reported children speaking in voices that didn't belong to them. Deep, adult voices, talking about people who'd been dead for decades. Some kids would beg to stay longer right before they died, like they were being called somewhere they didn't want to go. The deaths stopped in 1978 when they closed the pediatric ward permanently. Local families had already stopped bringing their children to the hospital during October. Mountain people learned to trust their instincts about these things. My fourth night, I saw them. I was cleaning the old playroom when movement in my peripheral vision made me look up. Children in hospital gowns were walking down the hallway, dozens of them, moving in single file like they were following some invisible line. They didn't make any sound. Not footsteps, not breathing, nothing. I should have run. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to drop the mop and get out of there. But something held me in place, maybe curiosity, maybe just the pure impossibility of what I was seeing. One of them noticed me watching. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, broke away from the line and approached me. Her hospital gown was old-fashioned, like something from decades ago, and when she got close enough, I could see that her eyes were wrong. Not the color or the shape, just wrong in a way I can't explain. She opened her mouth to speak, and what came out wasn't a child's voice. "We've been waiting," she said in a voice like autumn leaves scraping against concrete. "So long, so very long." The other children had stopped moving and were all staring at me now, 20-30 pairs of eyes reflecting the fluorescent light like animals caught in headlights. The little girl tilted her head at an angle that made my stomach lurch. "The machines," she said, gesturing toward the old medical equipment covered in sheets. "They held us here, caught between the ending and the after." I wanted to ask what she meant, but my throat had closed up. The air in the room was getting thicker, pressing against my chest like a weight. The temperature had dropped so fast I could see my breath. "Every October," the girl continued, "we grow stronger. Try to finish what was interrupted, but the barriers." She made a sound like static, like a radio trying to tune to a station that didn't exist. Behind her, the other children began to move again, but not walking this time. They were changing, stretching, their forms becoming less solid and more like shadows with teeth. The hospital gowns began to look less like clothing and more like burial shrouds. The little girl stepped closer, and I could smell something like old flowers and antiseptic. "You could help us," she whispered. "On the night when the veil is thinnest, you could open the way." That's when I ran. I dropped everything and sprinted for the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. Behind me, I could hear that static sound getting louder, mixed with children's laughter that echoed wrong in the empty building. The elevator doors were opening and closing rapidly as I passed the second floor, making a sound like grinding bones. I didn't stop until I reached my truck in the parking lot. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I looked back at the building and saw lights flickering in windows that should have been dark, shadows moving behind glass that reflected nothing. I called in sick for the rest of the week. Halloween night, I was at home watching TV when the power went out. Not just at my house. The whole holler went dark around midnight. When the lights came back on an hour later, my phone had 17 missed calls from the hospital's emergency line. I never called back. Mrs. Henderson found me the next week at the diner in town. She sat down across from me without being invited and ordered coffee like she belonged there. "You saw them," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, still not sure I believed it myself. "My grandmother worked at that hospital when it first opened," she continued. "Told me stories about the October children. Said they were caught between worlds when they died, too sudden, too wrong. Medical equipment interfering with natural processes." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Some things are older than science, boy. Older than hospitals and machines, and all our modern ideas about how death works. Those children, they're not exactly ghosts. They're something else. Something that got trapped when they should have been allowed to pass on." "What do they want?" I managed to ask. Mrs. Henderson's expression darkened. They want to finish dying. Problem is, they don't remember how to do it proper anymore. Been stuck too long, and every October, they get more confused, more angry, more willing to take someone with them to figure it out. She left money for her coffee and stood up. Hospital's closing that wing permanently next month. Board finally voted to seal it off. She paused at the door. Some things need to stay buried, especially when they've forgotten how to rest. I found a different job the next week. Security guard at a shopping mall, 19 mall, fluorescent lights, normal people, nothing older than 1,987. But sometimes, when October rolls around and the air gets that certain chill, I think about those children walking their endless hallway. I drive past Mercy General sometimes on my way to work. The third-floor windows are boarded up now, but on certain nights, especially when the moon is dark and the wind is still, I swear I can see light seeping through the cracks in the plywood. The hospital sold that wing to a developer last month. They're planning to tear it down and build condos. I wonder what they'll find when they start digging up the foundation. I wonder if some barriers are strong enough to survive demolition. I hope I never find out. But every Halloween, when the news reports power outages in that part of the county, I remember the weight of that little girl's eyes and the way she said, "We've been waiting." And I lock my doors and keep all the lights on until dawn, because some things that are trapped don't stay that way forever. They just get better at breaking free. I'm 31 years old and I work as an insurance adjuster. Or I used to, anyway. This happened 3 weeks ago, right here in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, and I haven't been back to work since. I keep telling myself I'm going to return tomorrow, but every time I try to drive to the office, my hands start shaking so bad I have to pull over. The Murphy Farm case came in on October 17th. Family claimed their barn had burned itself down and wanted compensation for what they called supernatural damage. I'd been doing this job for 7 years, seen every scam you can imagine. People burning down their own property, staging accidents, claiming acts of God for plain old negligence. This sounded like fraud with a creative twist. What I didn't know was that our company had a special file for claims like this. Rural properties, unexplained damage, families too scared to lie. My supervisor handed me the folder with a strange look on his face and said, "Just document everything, David. Everything." The Murphy Farm sits 15 miles outside Cook County, back where the forest grows thick and the cell towers don't reach. I'd driven these mountain roads my whole life, but somehow I took 3 wrong turns getting there. My GPS kept recalculating, showing roads that didn't exist when I looked up from the screen. The silence hit me first. Not peaceful quiet, the complete absence of sound that makes your ears ring. No birds, no insects, no wind, just dead air pressing against my eardrums like cotton. The forest crowded the property on all sides, dark even in full daylight, like the trees were leaning in to watch. The barn ruins made my stomach lurch. I've investigated maybe 200 fire claims. Fire spreads along fuel sources, follows air currents, burns upward. This barn had burned in a perfect spiral, starting from the center and coiling outward like a nautilus shell. The pattern was mathematically precise. I could see the golden ratio in the curve, even without measuring it. The metal roof hadn't just melted. It had been reformed into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Complex geometric structures that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating angles that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. When I tried to trace the patterns with my eyes, I got dizzy and nauseous. I pulled out my camera to document the damage. The screen went black every time I pointed it at the burn patterns. Not broken. It worked fine when I aimed it anywhere else. Same with my phone, my tablet, even my digital voice recorder. Every piece of electronic equipment failed within 10 feet of those ruins. The scorch marks on the ground were worse. Symbols burned into the earth that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Intricate designs that made my vision blur and my head pound. I tried sketching them in my notebook, but my hand cramped up every time I started drawing the curves. Mrs. Murphy came out of the house while I was kneeling by the symbols. She was maybe 55, weathered hands and careful eyes. The kind of mountain woman who'd seen hard times but didn't complain about them. She looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "You're the insurance man," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here about your barn claim." She studied my face for a long moment. "You got kids?" "No, ma'am." "Good. Don't bring nobody else out here. Not ever." She told me what happened the night of October 15th. How she'd woken up around 2 a.m. to see lights in the sky that weren't quite lights. Colors that moved like living things, painting impossible pictures against the darkness. The lights had descended and touched the barn, and reality had started to bend. "Wasn't like watching a fire," she said. "Fire's got substance to it. This was like watching the world get erased, then written back wrong." Their livestock, 12 head of cattle and 20-odd chickens, had been found the next morning, arranged in geometric patterns around the barn. Perfect mathematical formations that would have taken hours to create, except the animals were unharmed and showed no signs of being moved. They just stood there, motionless, staring at something nobody else could see. Mr. Murphy came out carrying his phone. He was a big man gone gaunt, like he'd lost 30 pounds in 2 days. His hands shook as he showed me the video they'd taken that night. I looked at the screen, and my brain rebelled. The images weren't just moving, they were moving in directions that don't exist. Geometries that folded through dimensions I couldn't perceive. After maybe 5 seconds, blood started dripping from my nose, and I had to look away. "That's what we saw, Mr. Murphy whispered. "That's what touched our barn." I finished my inspection in a daze. Every protocol I'd learned, every procedure I'd memorized, was useless here. How do you document evidence that your instruments can't record? How do you explain damage that violates the laws of physics? I drove back to town, planning to deny the claim. Whatever had happened at the Murphy farm, it wasn't covered under any policy I'd ever read, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with that place. Wrong in a way that hurt to think about. I was staying at the Mountain View Motel, planning to drive back to Nashville the next morning. That's when I realized the wrongness was following me. It started around 11 p.m. I was lying in bed trying to process what I'd seen when I noticed the room's geometry shifting. The corners had too many angles, like the walls were folding inward through space that shouldn't exist. I sat up and turned on the light, but the shadows fell in impossible directions. The sounds started at midnight. Not sounds, exactly. Mathematics being spoken in a language that predated human speech. Equations whispered in. Harmonics that made my teeth ache. The noise came from everywhere and nowhere, inside my skull and outside reality. I looked out the window toward the Murphy farm, maybe 10 miles away through the forest. The entire mountainside was glowing with that same knot light I'd seen in their video. Patterns of illumination that moved like living things, painting symbols against the darkness that my brain couldn't process. Something vast was trying to communicate, and it was using the fabric of reality as its medium. I couldn't take it anymore. I got dressed and drove back to the farm at 2 a.m., compelled by something I didn't understand. The road seemed longer this time, stretching through forests that were too deep and valleys that were too dark. My headlights carved through air that felt thick as water. When I reached the property, I found the barn completely restored. Not rebuilt, restored. The same weathered wood, the same rusted metal roof, but wrong in every measurable way. The structure existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, showing different versions of itself depending on how I looked at it. From one angle, it was the original barn. From another, it was something that had never been built by human hands. The door stood open, revealing darkness that had weight and texture. I walked inside. Mr. Murphy was waiting for me, but he wasn't Mr. Murphy anymore. He looked like himself from a distance, but up close I could see that his proportions were subtly wrong. His joints bent at angles that violated human anatomy. His eyes held knowledge that no terrestrial mind should contain. "You came back," he said, and his voice harmonized with itself in ways that made my bones vibrate. "We knew you would." He explained that entities from outside space-time had been trying to establish contact with our dimension for millennia. They'd finally found a way to breach the barrier, but they needed human consciousness as an interface. The barn was becoming a gateway, and minds like mine, logical, analytical, trained to document evidence, were the bridge they required. "Your species stands at a threshold, the thing that had been Mr. Murphy continued. We offer evolution, expansion beyond your limited three-dimensional existence. You can be the first to ascend." I felt my consciousness being stretched, pulled beyond human limitations. For a terrifying moment, I could perceive reality as these entities did. Infinite dimensions folding through each other, time moving in spirals instead of lines, space curved back on itself in impossible geometries. The universe was vast and connected and beautiful in ways that language couldn't express, but human brains aren't designed for that kind of awareness. I could feel everything that made me David, my memories, my personality, my humanity, being erased and overwritten with cosmic knowledge. I was becoming something else, something that understood the mathematics of reality but had forgotten what it meant to be human. I fought back the only way I knew how. I focused on the most mundane aspects of my existence: policy numbers, claim procedures, actuarial tables. I recited coverage limitations and bureaucratic processes like prayers, anchoring myself to the boring, repetitive nature of human civilization. But it wasn't enough. The cosmic knowledge kept flooding in, washing away my identity piece by piece. I was losing the fight. That's when I remembered something my supervisor had told me years ago. The paperwork is what makes us human, David. Bureaucracy, filing systems, forms in triplicate, that's how we impose order on chaos. That's how we stay sane in an insane world. I pulled out my notebook and started documenting everything I was experiencing. Not the cosmic revelations, the mundane details. The temperature of the air, the texture of the dirt under my feet, the exact time on my watch. I turned the most profound experience in human history into an insurance claim, reducing infinite cosmic truth to checkbox items and liability assessments. The entities recoiled. My aggressive mundanity was like acid to them, burning through their attempts at mental contact. They couldn't comprehend a consciousness that would willingly choose bureaucracy over enlightenment, paperwork over transcendence. "You reject paradise," the Murphy thing said, its voice fracturing with harmonics of confusion and disgust. "I reject losing myself," I replied, still writing. "This claim is denied due to insufficient documentation and failure to provide measurable evidence of supernatural causation." Reality snapped back like a rubber band. I was standing in the ruins of a burned barn, alone, with my notebook full of gibberish and blood dripping from my nose. The Murphy family was gone, had been gone for days, according to the neighbors. They'd disappeared the night after their barn burned, leaving behind only empty rooms and the smell of ozone. I drove back to town in silence, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I filed my report the next morning, denying the claim due to insufficient evidence. My supervisor accepted it without question, but I caught him looking at me strangely for the rest of the week. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't been back to work since. Every time I try to leave my apartment, I see geometric patterns in cloud formations and sidewalk cracks. Mathematical equations written in the shadows between buildings. The entities are still trying to reach me, but they're being more subtle now. More patient. I've started seeing other adjusters in coffee shops around Nashville, people I don't recognize who work for companies that don't exist. They nod at me knowingly and order drinks with names that sound like quantum physics equations. Yesterday, one of them slipped me a business card that read, "Department of Extranormal Claims, we document the impossible." I haven't called the number yet, but I know I will, because some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. And sometimes the most ordinary jobs put you face to face with the most extraordinary horrors. The worst part? I'm starting to miss the cosmic knowledge, the brief moment when I understood how the universe really works. Human consciousness feels cramped and limited now, like trying to live in a house with rooms too small and ceilings too low. But I remember what Mrs. Murphy asked me, "You got kids?" I understand now why that mattered. Because if I had loved ones, if I had people depending on me to stay human, the temptation to evolve beyond this limited existence would be unbearable. As it stands, I'm barely holding on. The Murphy farm burned down again last week. Lightning strike, according to the official report. But I know better. The entities are cleaning up, erasing evidence, preparing for their next attempt. And somewhere in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, another insurance adjuster is driving down a dirt road toward a claim that will change everything they thought they knew about reality. I hope they're better at staying human than I am. I was 26 when I took that substitute teaching job in Crow Mountain, North Carolina. Looking back now, I should have known something was wrong when they offered me triple the usual rate for a single day's work. But I'd just gotten out of a bad relationship and was living paycheck to paycheck in my little apartment outside Asheville. When the district office called me at 5:30 a.m. on October 25th, saying they desperately needed someone to cover at a rural elementary school deep in the Blue Ridge, I didn't ask enough questions. I just threw on some clothes, grabbed my teaching materials, and started the winding drive into the mountains. The GPS lost signal about 40 minutes into the drive, right around the time the cell towers disappeared too. I had to navigate using an old paper map I found in my glove compartment, following increasingly narrow roads that seemed to twist back on themselves. The deeper I went, the more isolated everything became. No gas stations, no convenience stores, just endless forest and the occasional glimpse of a weathered cabin tucked back in the trees. By the time I reached Crow Mountain Elementary, I felt like I'd driven into another century. The school was a single brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. There were maybe 30 kids total, scattered across 6 grades, and they all had that particular look of mountain children, old eyes and young faces, like they'd seen things that aged them beyond their years. The principal, Mrs. Garrett, met me in the parking lot instead of waiting in her office, which struck me as odd. She was a thin woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back so tight it stretched the skin around her eyes. "You're the substitute," she said, more statement than question. Her voice carried that familiar Appalachian accent, but there was something clipped about it, like she was choosing her words carefully. "I need to tell you about our curriculum requirements for this week." She handed me a manila folder without meeting my eyes. "The children have been preparing for their October presentations. Family traditions, you understand. Mountain ways that go back generations." I opened the folder and immediately felt something cold settle in my stomach. Instead of normal lesson plans, there were pages of what looked like song lyrics written in a language I didn't recognize. The characters were vaguely familiar, maybe some form of old Celtic or Germanic script, but the words themselves meant nothing to me. At the bottom of each page, someone had written English translations in spidery handwriting. "We call to those who sleep beneath. We offer what we cherish most. We feed the mountain's hunger." "What exactly am I supposed to do with these?" I asked Mrs. Garrett. But she was already walking away. "The children know what to do," she called over her shoulder. "Just follow their lead. And Miss Collins, whatever you see today, whatever you hear, it's best if you keep it to yourself. Mountain folk don't take kindly to outsiders spreading stories." The first red flag should have been how quiet the building was. 30 children in 6 grades should have created a constant buzz of activity, but Crow Mountain Elementary felt tomb silent. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as I made my way to the classroom Mrs. Garrett had indicated. Room 7, at the very end of the building, isolated from the other classrooms. When I opened the door, all 15 children, ranging from about 5 years old to maybe 11, turned to look at me in perfect unison. They were already seated at their desks, hands folded, backs straight, like they'd been waiting in that exact position for hours. Their eyes followed me as I walked to the front of the room, and I noticed that none of them were fidgeting or whispering to each other the way kids normally do. "Good morning, class," I said, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. "I'm Miss Collins, and I'll be your teacher today." Without any prompting from me, they began to sing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed far too sophisticated for children their age. But the sound of it made every hair on my body stand up. There was something fundamentally wrong about those voices blending together, something that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the primal part of my brain that screamed danger. The foreign words flowed from their mouths like they'd been speaking that language their entire lives, and underneath the pretty melody was a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, or like something breathing. When they finished, the silence that followed was complete. No shuffling papers, no clearing throats, no outside noise from other classrooms. Just dead quiet and 15 pairs of eyes staring at me expectantly. "That was very nice," I managed. "Can anyone tell me what the song was about?" The oldest boy, maybe 11, raised his hand. "We're calling them home, Miss Collins. The old ones who sleep under the mountain. We're telling them we remember the bargain our families made." "What kind of bargain?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. A little girl in the front row, She couldn't have been older than 6, smiled brightly. Every October, we give them what they need so they'll keep protecting our families. It's been that way since my great-great-grandmother's time, maybe longer. Give them what? The young ones, said another child matter-of-factly. The mountain gets hungry, and we feed it. That's why we practice the songs. So when it's our turn, we'll know how to call them properly. I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Your turn for what? The oldest boy, I later learned his name was Billy, stood up from his desk. To help, Miss Collins. To join the old ones under the mountain and keep our families safe. My sister Mary helped 2 years ago. She was so brave. His voice was filled with genuine pride and admiration. I hope I get chosen this year. I've been practicing the songs every night. The other children nodded in agreement, their faces bright with anticipation. They were talking about human sacrifice, about their own deaths, like other kids might discuss a school play or a birthday party. The casual horror of it made my vision blur around the edges. I spent the rest of the morning trying to conduct normal lessons, but the children kept steering every conversation back to their October traditions. During art time, I asked them to draw pictures of their families. Every single drawing showed the same thing: stick figures of adults and children walking toward something dark and shapeless in the woods. The thing in the woods had teeth. That's the feeding place, explained Sarah, the 6-year-old, pointing to her drawing. The old ones live in the deep cave under Grandfather Rock. When October comes, the families bring the chosen ones there and sing the calling songs. The chosen ones? I asked, though I was beginning to understand. The kids who get picked to help, said Billy. It's a great honor. Not every family gets chosen every year. Lunch period was when I started to understand the scope of what was happening. Other teachers avoided our classroom entirely. When I tried to engage them in the hallway, they gave me tight smiles and hurried away. The few words I did catch from their conversations included phrases like, "almost time," and "hope it goes smoothly this year." During the afternoon, I made an excuse about needing supplies and explored the school. In the principal's office, I found a filing cabinet that wasn't locked. Inside were enrollment records going back decades, and what I saw there made my hands shake. Every October for the past 30 years, 2 or 3 children had been marked as transferred or moved away. But their families were still listed as local residents. Mrs. Garrett found me there. "You shouldn't be looking through those files," she said quietly, closing the cabinet door. "Some things are better left alone." "Where are those children?" I demanded. "The ones who supposedly transferred every October?" She looked at me with something that might have been pity. "They went where they needed to go. They did what their families required of them. Just like children have been doing in these mountains for longer than you can imagine." "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about survival," she snapped, her composed facade cracking for the first time. "You think our families have lived in these mountains for 7 generations by accident? You think our crops grow and our animals stay healthy and our children are born strong because of luck?" She stepped closer, and I could smell something metallic on her breath. "There are things in these mountains that were here long before the first white settlers arrived, things that the Cherokee knew better than to disturb. We learned to make peace with them, Miss Collins. We learned to give them what they want. And what they want is children. What they want is young life, fresh energy, the promise of continuation." Her voice had taken on an almost religious tone. "In exchange, they protect us. They keep the bad things away. They make sure our families prosper." I left the school that day, but I didn't drive home. Instead, I parked my car at an old hunting lodge about 2 miles away and hiked back through the woods. I had to know if what Mrs. Garrett was telling me was true. I had to see for myself. As the sun set, I followed voices deeper into the forest. The temperature kept dropping, and my breath started coming out in visible puffs even though it had been warm during the day. The woods were completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the sound of my footsteps on dead leaves and the distant murmur of human voices, singing those same haunting melodies I'd heard in the classroom. I found them in a clearing about a mile from the school. Dozens of families, the parents of all the children I'd taught that day, plus others I didn't recognize. They were arranged in a perfect circle around something that made my rational mind simply refuse to process what I was seeing. There was a hole in the ground. Not just any hole, something vast and perfectly round, like a well that went down to the center of the earth. But the edges weren't made of stone or dirt. They were made of something that looked organic, something that pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm. And rising from that hole was a smell that made my eyes water. Ancient earth and rotting meat and something else, something fundamentally alien. The families were singing, their voices blending in those complex harmonies I'd heard earlier. But now I could see what they were singing to. Something was moving in the depths of that hole, something vast and patient and hungry. As the song continued, shapes began to emerge from the darkness below. Not quite tentacles, not quite arms, but appendages that reached up toward the surface with obvious intelligence and purpose. That's when I saw the children. Billy was there, along with 2 other kids from my class, a girl named Emma who couldn't have been 7, and a boy named Thomas who was maybe 9. They stood at the edge of the circle, holding hands, their faces glowing with pride and anticipation. Their parents were behind them, tears streaming down their faces, but still singing, still participating in what was about to happen. The oldest voice in the circle, an ancient woman I hadn't noticed before, began speaking in English between verses of the song. "We offer what we cherish most," she called out. "We give freely what is precious to us. We feed the mountain's hunger so that our families may prosper." The children stepped forward. I should have run. I should have screamed. I should have done something. But I was frozen, transfixed by the horrible beauty of what I was witnessing. The ritual had a terrible logic to it, a sense of tradition and purpose that went back generations. These people genuinely believed they were protecting their families, preserving their way of life. The children believed it too. They walked toward that impossible hole with joy on their faces. Billy went first. He began singing as he approached the edge, his young voice carrying clearly through the night air. The things in the hole reached up for him, and he stepped forward willingly, eagerly. The last thing I saw was his smile. Then Emma, then Thomas. The hole closed. Not gradually, not slowly, it simply wasn't there anymore. The ground was smooth and unremarkable, covered with the same dead leaves as the rest of the forest floor. The families dispersed quickly and quietly, walking back toward their homes with the satisfied air of people who had completed an important task. I stayed hidden in the woods until dawn, too terrified to move. When the sun finally came up, I crept back to where the clearing had been. There was nothing there. No hole, no signs of a gathering, no evidence that anything unusual had ever happened. Just ordinary forest, indistinguishable from any other patch of Appalachian woodland. I drove home and called in sick for the next 3 days. When I finally returned to work, I was told that Crow Mountain Elementary had been permanently closed due to enrollment issues. The children had been redistributed to other schools in the district. But when I checked with those other schools, none of them had any record of new students from Crow Mountain. I never reported what I saw. Who would have believed me? And more importantly, what evidence did I have? None. The school was closed, the families had scattered, and there was nothing in those woods but trees and rocks and the kind of deep silence that makes you understand why people avoid certain places. I still work as a substitute teacher, but I'm much more careful about which assignments I accept. I research the schools, the communities, the families. I ask questions about local history and traditions. And every October, when the leaves start to turn and the air gets that crisp edge that promises winter, I find myself checking missing children reports from rural areas across Appalachia. The numbers are small enough that they don't make national news. A child here, a child there, always from isolated communities, always marked as runaways or family relocations. But I know better now. I know that there are places in these mountains where old bargains are still kept, where families still honor agreements made generations ago with things that sleep beneath the earth. Sometimes, on quiet October nights, I think I can still hear those children singing. I was 24 when I started delivering groceries for Mountain Fresh Supply, a little company that served the really remote areas of West Virginia where the big chains wouldn't go. The pay was decent enough, and honestly, I liked the drive through the mountains. Growing up in Charleston, I'd always felt more at peace in the woods than in the city. What I didn't know was that some places in those mountains aren't meant for people like me. This happened on October 30th, 2019. I remember the date because it was the day before Halloween, and I'd been planning to drive down to my girlfriend's place in Virginia after work. I had one last delivery for the day, a big order for the Hartwell family up on Devil's Backbone Ridge. 50 pounds of supplies, which was pretty normal for families that far out. But what caught my attention was the amount of raw meat they'd ordered. 3 whole chickens, 5 pounds of ground beef, and a bunch of steaks. I figured they were stocking up for winter, or maybe having a big family gathering. The GPS took me 12 miles up a winding dirt road that got narrower and rougher the higher I climbed. I'd been driving these mountain routes for about 8 months by then, so I was used to places that felt like they were at the edge of the world, but this one felt different somehow. The trees seemed to lean in over the road like they were trying to block out the sky, and after about mile 5, my cell service died completely. That's when I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. The air had this weird smell, metallic, like old pennies, but mixed with something organic and sweet, like fruit that had gone bad. My truck's radio started picking up static that almost sounded like people whispering, but I couldn't make out any words. I kept adjusting the dial, thinking maybe I could find a clear station, but it was just that weird static no matter where I tuned it. Then I saw the cairns. They started small, just little stacks, made of rocks by the roadside that could have been trail markers or something kids had built. But as I drove deeper into the mountains, they got bigger. Some of them were as tall as fence posts, carefully balanced in ways that looked impossible. And between the trees, I could see red cloth strips hanging from branches like some kind of trail markers, leading deeper into the forest. The whole time I was driving, I kept thinking how quiet everything was. I mean, dead quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the leaves. Just the sound of my truck's engine and that static coming from the radio. Looking back now, I should have turned around right then, but I was young and stupid and needed the money. Plus, I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation for everything. When I finally reached the address, there was a house there, which surprised me because a lot of these remote deliveries were just to mailboxes where people would meet you. But this house looked wrong somehow. It was too new, too perfect for being this far out in the middle of nowhere. Fresh white paint, perfect shingles, landscaping that looked like it belonged in a suburb. And smoke was rising from the chimney in these perfect spirals, not moving at all despite the fact that there should have been wind up there on the ridge. A woman came out onto the porch and waved at me. She was smiling this huge smile and walking in this weird, too smooth way, like she was gliding instead of walking. "Marcus," she called out, using my name even though I'd never seen her before in my life. "Thank you so much for bringing dinner." That's when I noticed her smile was too wide, showing way too many teeth, and her eyes weren't blinking, not even once. I grabbed the grocery bags from the back of my truck, trying to act normal even though every instinct I had was telling me to get back in the cab and drive away. When I got closer to her, I could smell that same metallic organic smell from the beautifully one friend. Road, but stronger. It was coming from her. "Come on inside," she said, still with that too wide smile. "The family's waiting to meet you." I followed her into the house, and that's where I met the rest of the Hartwells. A husband, 2 teenage kids, a boy and a girl. They all turned to look at me at exactly the same time, like they were puppets being controlled by the same person. And they all had that same too wide smile. "Welcome, Marcus," they said in perfect unison. The house smelled like the road and the woman, but concentrated, like being inside a copper pipe that something had died in. Their skin had this waxy, translucent quality, and I could see dark veins running underneath it like tree roots. When they moved together, perfectly synchronized, like a dance they'd practiced 1,000 times. I set the groceries down on their kitchen counter, trying not to look at them directly. "That'll be $87.50, I said, just wanting to get paid and get out of there. "Oh, we don't pay with money," the father said. And all 4 of them laughed at exactly the same time. That's when I tried to leave. I mumbled something about having other deliveries and headed for the door, but when I got to my truck, it wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. I tried again and again, and through the windshield I could see the whole family standing on their porch, watching me. They weren't upset or concerned about my truck not starting. They looked pleased, like everything was going exactly according to plan. The father walked over to my driver's side window. "Don't worry about that old truck," he said. "We've been waiting for a fresh delivery, and you're exactly what we need." That's when I noticed the bones. They were arranged in patterns around the property, geometric shapes and symbols I didn't recognize. At first I thought they were animal bones, maybe from hunting, but when I looked closer, I realized they were too big, too human. I got out of the truck and started backing away from the house. The family was still standing on the porch, but they were changing. Their perfect human appearances were melting away like wax masks in heat. What I'd thought were people were something else entirely, just wearing human shapes like costumes that didn't fit right. Their real forms were pale and elongated, with joints that bent in directions that shouldn't have been possible. They moved with this predatory grace, spreading out to circle me like a pack of wolves that had cornered a deer. "We only need to feed once a year," the thing that had been the mother said, her voice now sounding like it was coming from underwater. "October is our time. And delivery drivers work so well. You're already isolated, already expected to disappear for hours at a time." I ran. I crashed into the tree line while they were still transforming, using the darkness of the forest to hide. Behind me, I could hear them communicating with these clicking, insect-like sounds, and I could hear them moving through the trees. They stayed just out of sight, but I knew they were getting closer. They were herding me, driving me deeper into the mountains, away from any possible escape route. This was a game to them. They could have caught me immediately, but they were enjoying my fear. I found an old hunting cabin about 2 miles into the woods and barricaded myself inside with everything I could. Move, chairs, a table, an old dresser. The things surrounded the cabin but didn't attack right away. They were savoring the anticipation, clicking and whispering to each other in their alien language. I got a fire going in the fireplace and started burning everything I could find: old magazines, pieces of furniture, anything that would create thick smoke. The smoke seemed to disorient them, interfering with whatever senses they used to track me. I realized they weren't hunting by sight or sound. They were sensing my fear and my body heat. While they were confused by the smoke, I covered myself in mud and ash from the fireplace to mask my scent and heat signature. When the wind picked up, I slipped out the back window of the cabin and started moving as quietly as I could through the forest. I followed a stream downhill for what felt like hours, knowing it would eventually lead to civilization. The creatures discovered my escape too late. By the time they figured out I wasn't in the cabin anymore, I had enough of a head start to stay ahead of them. At dawn, I reached a logging road, where a trucker found me covered in mud and babbling about monsters in the mountains. He drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They went up to Devil's Backbone Ridge to investigate, but they didn't find any evidence of the Hartwell family or their house. According to the GPS coordinates, there was nothing there but empty forest. My delivery company had no record of the order, and the address didn't exist in their system. I quit that job the next day and moved to Richmond, where I could be around people constantly. I work in an office building now, 20th floor, surrounded by concrete and steel and thousands of other people. I never go hiking anymore, never take scenic routes through the mountains. Sometimes I still get phone calls from blocked numbers. When I answer, there's just that static whisper sound from my truck radio, and then a voice that sounds almost human says, "We have an order for fresh delivery to Devil's Backbone Ridge." I hang up immediately and don't sleep for the rest of the night, because I know now that some of those mountain communities aren't communities at all. They're feeding grounds, and they're still waiting for their next delivery. I'm 19, and I babysit for extra money while going to community college here in eastern Kentucky. My family's been in these mountains for 5 generations, so I know the difference between normal mountain quiet and the kind of silence that means something's wrong. I should have trusted that instinct on October 28th when the Morrison family called me to watch their daughter Sophie. They offered me double my usual rate to drive out to their place near Pineville, 8 miles into the holler where the cell towers don't reach, and the old stories still feel real. The Morrisons had moved to Kentucky from Ohio 3 years back, bought an old farmhouse that had been sitting empty since the 1972nd. Mrs. Morrison seemed jittery when she was explaining Sophie's bedtime routine, kept checking the locks and glancing toward the tree line like she was expecting company. Sophie was 4 years old, blonde curls, and serious blue eyes that seemed to see more than a child should. While her parents finished getting ready, She showed me her crayon drawings, stick figures playing in a yard, but one figure loomed over the others, impossibly tall, with arms that stretched down like broken branches. "That's the October Man," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "He comes to check on me every year. He's been waiting a long time." Mrs. Morrison forced a laugh when I asked about it. "Sophie's got quite the imagination since we moved here. Kids pick up on local folklore, you know how it is." But I noticed how she pulled every curtain shut before they left, and how Mr. Morrison checked the locks twice. "We'll be back by midnight," she said. "Call if anything feels off." The moment their headlights disappeared down the mountain road, the wrongness settled in. Country quiet is one thing. I grew up with it. But this was different. Heavier. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. Sophie ran straight to the living room window and pressed her face against the glass. "He's early. Tonight," she whispered, her breath fogging the window. "Look, Emma, he's been stacking stones all day." I looked where she was pointing and felt my stomach drop. Stone cairns surrounded the house in a perfect circle, each stack about 3 feet high with a piece of red cloth tied to the top. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I would have noticed something that obvious. But there they were, like they'd grown from the ground while we weren't looking. "Sophie, when did those appear?" "He builds them when October gets close to Halloween, 23 times now. I can show you where he keeps count." She led me to her bedroom and pointed at the wall beside her window. Deep scratches carved into the wood, 19,023 precise tally marks, each one about 8 feet off the floor. Too high for a child, too deliberate for random damage. The scratches looked fresh, like something had been adding to them recently. "That's how many Octobers he's watched over our family," Sophie explained. "Mama says it's just old damage from before we moved here, but I know better. He was here first, and he's been waiting for someone like me." The metallic smell hit me then, sharp and bitter like pennies mixed with battery acid. It seemed to seep through the walls, getting stronger as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. I checked all the doors and windows, more from growing unease than any real plan. That's when I found the handprints in the mud outside the back door. 4 fingers. Each print was 12 inches long, pressed deep into the earth like whatever made them weighed far more than it should. The prints led from the forest to every window of the house, circling the foundation in a deliberate pattern. Something had been studying the house, learning its layout, marking its territory. "He's getting ready," Sophie said from behind me, making me jump. "This is the year he's been waiting for. I'm finally old enough." "Old enough for what, honey?" But Sophie had already skipped back inside, humming a tune I didn't recognize, something that sounded older than the mountains themselves. By 9 o'clock, the forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, no wind in the trees. Even the usual settling sounds of the old house seemed muffled, like we were trapped under a thick blanket. That's when the footsteps started. 200. Slow, measured steps circling the house in a pattern that never varied. Too heavy for a person, too deliberate for an animal. Sophie would run to whatever window was closest to the sound, pressing her small hands against the glass and whispering to something I couldn't see. Through the gaps in the curtains, I caught glimpses of pale movement between the trees, something tall and wrong that moved like broken machinery, all jerky movements and impossible angles. "He's checking to make sure I'm safe," Sophie told me. "He's been protecting our family for so long, but now it's time for me to go with him. That's how it works in the mountains. The old things take care of us, and sometimes we have to take care of them too." My hands shook as I tried to call 911, but the phone kept connecting to numbers that shouldn't exist. Voices that sounded human but spoke in rhythms that hurt to listen to, repeating the same phrase. "The child belongs to October now. The child belongs to October now." Around 10:30, Sophie's eyelids started to droop. "I should go to bed now," she said with that same unnaturally calm voice. "He doesn't like to wait much longer, and Mama says I should always be polite to guests." I wasn't about to let her sleep, not with that thing circling outside like a predator waiting for the right moment. But as soon as I said we should stay awake together, Sophie's demeanor changed completely. Her blue eyes went flat and cold, and when she spoke, her voice carried an echo that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than her small chest. "The bargain was made before I was born, Emma. Before Mama and Daddy even met. The October Man has been patient, but patience has limits. I have to go to him willingly, or he'll take everyone in the house instead. That's when I understood. This wasn't just some random supernatural encounter. It was a transaction that had been planned for years. The Morrisons hadn't stumbled onto this property by accident. They'd been guided here, drawn by whatever force had been marking time and waiting for the right child to be born. The creature emerged fully from the tree line, just as the clock struck 11. 8 feet tall, with gray skin that looked like old leather stretched over bones that were shaped all wrong. Its arms hung past its knees, ending in those 4-fingered hands I'd seen in the mud. The head tilted at an angle that should have been impossible, and when it moved, every joint bent in directions that made my eyes water. But the worst part was its face, ancient beyond measure, with deep-set eyes that held an intelligence older than human civilization. This thing had been in these mountains since before the Cherokee, before anyone had names for the hollers and ridges. It had been waiting and watching and making bargains with families who thought they understood the price. Sophie walked to the front door and started to unlock it. Her movements were calm and purposeful, like she was following instructions she'd been practicing her whole life. I grabbed her shoulders, but she was stronger than any 4-year-old should be. And when she looked at me, I saw something else looking back through her eyes. "It's not Sophie's choice anymore," she said in that echoing voice. "The October man has been kind. He's waited until I was old enough to understand. Most of the mountain children don't get that courtesy." I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed every light in the house and aimed them at the windows. Floodlights, table lamps, even the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The creature recoiled from the brightness with a sound like breaking glass, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it began to change. The gray skin rippled and shifted, taking on familiar features. First, it looked like Mr. Morrison, then Mrs. Morrison. Then finally, it settled into a perfect copy of Sophie herself. 4-year-old Sophie stood in the yard, calling to 4-year-old Sophie in the house, asking to be let in because she was cold and scared and didn't understand why Emma was being so mean. "Please let me in." The thing wearing Sophie's face pleaded through the window. "I just want to come home." "Why won't you let me come home?" The real Sophie, or what was left of her, turned to me with tears streaming down her face. "He's showing me what will happen if I don't go with him willingly. He'll become me, and no one will ever know the difference. Mama and Daddy will love him just like they love me, and I'll be trapped in the woods forever, watching him live my life." I kept the lights trained on the creature, but I could feel my resolve weakening. This wasn't a battle I could win with flashlights and determination. This was something that had been set in motion long before I was born, by people who thought they could outsmart forces they didn't understand. But then I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me about the old bargains in these mountains. They always had loopholes, because the mountain spirits were bound by rules older than human memory. You just had to be clever enough to find them. "Sophie," I said, not taking my eyes off the creature in the yard, "what exactly did your family promise the October man?" A child born in October, to go with him willingly on her 4th Halloween, Sophie recited like she was remembering a bedtime story, in exchange for protection and prosperity for the family line. "And what happens if the child doesn't go willingly?" Sophie's eyes widened as she understood what I was getting at. "Then the bargain is broken, and he has to wait for another child to be born in October." I looked at the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. October 28th. 3 days until Halloween, and Sophie wouldn't turn 5 until October 15th of next year. If we could just keep her from going willingly for 3 more days, the bargain would be void. "We're not giving in," I told the creature still wearing Sophie's face. "Find another family to make deals with." The thing in the yard let out a sound that was part shriek, part sob, and part something that had no name in any human language. Its stolen features melted away, revealing the ancient, patient intelligence underneath. But instead of rage, I saw something that might have been respect in those deep-set eyes. It began to fade back into the forest, but not before leaving one final message. Carved into the oak tree by the front porch, in letters that seemed to burn themselves into the wood. "The debt remains. Interest accrues. We are patient." Dawn came slowly, but it came. Sophie collapsed from exhaustion around sunrise, sleeping the deep sleep of a child who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for her small shoulders. When the Morrisons returned, I told them everything, 1257. Not expecting them to believe me, but hoping they'd at least take Sophie and leave. They were packed and gone within the week. Not to another town in Kentucky, but back to Ohio, where Mrs. Morrison's family could help watch Sophie during October months. They'd finally understood that some properties come with prices that can't be paid in monthly mortgage installments. I never babysat in the deep hollers again after that. But every October, I think about Sophie and wonder if the October man is still waiting in those woods, counting down the years until she has a daughter of her own. Because that's how these old bargains work in the mountains. They don't just end with one generation. They echo through bloodlines until someone finally pays what's owed or finds a way to break the cycle completely. I just hope Sophie remembers what her grandmother's debt really cost and thinks twice before bringing any October babies into this world. Some debts are too dangerous to inherit, and some mountains hold memories longer than human families can survive them. I'm 24 years old, and up until last week, I delivered groceries for a small company called Mountain Fresh that serves the remote areas around West Virginia. I say, up until last week, because I don't do that job anymore, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to drive those mountain roads again. I've been staring at this laptop screen for 3 hours now, trying to figure out how to tell you what happened to me on October 30th without sounding completely insane. Mountain Fresh isn't a big operation. Just me, 2 other drivers, and our dispatcher Sarah, who works out of a converted gas station in Beckley. We deliver to folks living way back in the hollers where the big chains won't go, places where the roads are more like suggestions and your GPS gives up halfway there. I'd been doing the job for about 2 years, long enough to know every backwoods trail and which bridges you shouldn't trust after heavy rain. That Tuesday started normal enough. I had my usual route, Mrs. Henderson up on Copperhead Creek, the Mullins family near the old mining camp, a few others scattered around the ridges. But right as I was finishing up, Sarah called me back to the office with a last-minute delivery. She had this weird expression on her face when she handed me the order slip, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You ever heard of the Hartwell family?" she asked, tapping the paper with her pen. I shook my head. After 2 years, I knew most of our regular customers by their first names. "Address is just GPS coordinates," she continued. "Up on Devil's Backbone Ridge. They want 50 pounds of supplies, canned goods, flour, rice, and the works. Paid in cash, left the money in an envelope under our door this morning." She showed me the envelope, old-looking bills, nothing smaller than a 20, and they smelled musty like they'd been stored in an attic for years. The order was written in careful cursive on letterhead that said, "Hartwell Family, Devil's Backbone Ridge," but no phone number, no other contact information. "You want me to take it?" I asked, checking my watch. It was already past 4 p.m. "They specifically requested you," Sarah said, and that's when I got my first chill. "Asked for the young man with the red truck. That's you, Marcus." I loaded up my truck with their groceries, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled in my stomach. The GPS coordinates led me 12 miles up a winding dirt road that got narrower with each switchback. The trees pressed in on both sides until I was driving through a tunnel of gold and red leaves, beautiful in that way. October in Appalachia always is, but there was something wrong with the quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of my engine echoing off the hillsides like I was the only living thing for miles. My cell service died after mile 5, which was normal up there, but my radio started picking up strange interference, voices speaking what sounded like backwards English, fading in and out between bursts of static. I turned it off and kept driving, telling myself it was just atmospheric disturbance from the mountains. When I reached the coordinates, there was no house, just a burned foundation covered in dead leaves and a few blackened stone chimneys reaching up through the trees like accusing fingers. The GPS showed I was exactly where I was supposed to be, but nobody had lived there for years, maybe decades. I sat in my truck with the engine running, trying to figure out what to do. The whole area felt wrong. The trees were bare and gray like it was deep winter instead of late October, and the ground had that scorched look you see after a forest fire, even though there hadn't been any fires in this area recently. That's when I noticed the silence wasn't natural. It was too complete, too deliberate, like something was actively suppressing all sound. I tried calling the office, but my phone was completely dead, despite showing a full charge when I'd left town. Even my truck's digital clock had stopped working. I decided to turn around and head back, Maybe ask around town about the Hartwells tomorrow, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine was completely dead. No click from the starter, no dashboard lights, nothing. I popped the hood and everything looked normal, but there was this smell in the air around the engine bay, metallic and sharp, like the taste you get in your mouth before a lightning strike. Storm clouds had rolled in while I wasn't paying attention, and the rain started as a light drizzle that quickly turned into a downpour. I ran back to the truck to wait it out, but when I looked in my mirrors, I could see the dirt road behind me had turned into a river of mud. Even if my truck started, there was no way I was getting down that mountain until the storm passed and the road dried out. I was trapped on Devil's Backbone Ridge with night falling fast and no way to call for help. That's when I heard the dinner bell. The sound was coming from deeper in the woods, past the burned foundation. It rang slow and steady, 6 times, then silence, then 6 times again. I grabbed my flashlight, thankfully it still worked, and followed the sound, partly because I was curious, and partly because where there's a dinner bell, there might be people who could help. The rain had stopped as suddenly as it started, but everything was still dripping. I could smell wet earth and something else underneath it, something sour and organic, like meat that had been left out too long. About a quarter mile into the woods, following what might have once been a path, I found a cabin that definitely hadn't been there when I'd arrived. It was sitting in a small clearing, warm yellow light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. The dinner bell hung from a post on the front porch, still swaying slightly. I could smell food cooking inside, something that made my mouth water despite the growing knot of dread in my stomach. "Marcus," a woman's voice called from inside, sweet and welcoming. "Come in, dinner's ready. We've been waiting for you." I froze. I had never told anyone my name, and the Hartwells had specifically requested me without knowing who I was. The voice sounded normal enough, but there was something underneath it, like an echo of an echo. I crept closer to one of the windows and peered inside. A family of 4 was sitting around a dinner table: father, mother, teenage son, younger daughter. They were perfectly still, like they were posing for a photograph that was taking too long to shoot. None of them were blinking. None of them were breathing that I could see. They just sat there with identical smiles stretched across their faces, staring straight ahead at nothing. The food on the table looked real enough: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie. Steam was rising from the dishes, and I could smell it through the glass. But something about the scene made my skin crawl, like I was looking at a dollhouse where someone had arranged the figures but forgotten to make them look alive. "Don't be shy, Marcus," the father said, without moving his lips or changing his expression. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "We ordered those groceries because we knew you'd be hungry when you got here." That's when I realized they weren't just still, they were wrong. The proportions were off in ways that hurt to look at directly. The mother's arms were too long, hanging down past her knees. The children's heads were tilted at angles that should have snapped their necks. The father's smile extended too far across his face, showing teeth that went back further than teeth should go. "We've been so lonely up here," the mother said, still not moving. "It's been almost a year since our last dinner guest." I backed away from the window as quietly as I could, but dead leaves crunched under my feet no matter how carefully I stepped. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the unnatural silence. "Marcus," the daughter's voice called, high and sweet. "Where are you going? We made your favorite." I had no idea what my favorite anything was supposed to be, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I headed for the tree line, moving as quickly as I dared through the undergrowth. Behind me, I heard the cabin door open with a long, drawn-out creak. "He's being modest," the son said, and his voice was coming from outside now. "We'll have to go get him." I could hear them moving through the forest, but their footsteps didn't sound right. Too heavy, too measured, like they were learning how to walk as they went. And there were too many footsteps, more than 4 people could make. I found a thick cluster of mountain laurel and crawled underneath, trying to control my breathing. Through the tangle of branches, I could see lights moving between the trees, not flashlights, but something that glowed with its own cold radiance. "Marcus," the mother's voice called, and it was close enough that I could hear it clearly. "We know you're scared, but there's nothing to be afraid of. We just want to have dinner with you. We've prepared something special." The lights were getting closer, sweeping back and forth like they were searching. I worked my way deeper into the laurel thicket, trying not to make any noise, but every branch that brushed against my jacket sounded like breaking bones in the silence. "The meat is getting cold," the father said, and his voice was coming from a different direction now. They had spread out, surrounding my hiding spot. That would be such a waste. I managed to crawl out the back of the thicket and made my way deeper into the woods, moving from tree to tree and trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and those voices. That's when I found the old oak tree, with the hollow in its trunk. Inside the hollow was a collection of papers, protected from the weather by a plastic bag. They were delivery receipts, yellowed with age and brittle around the edges, but I could still read most of them, all for the same thing: 50 pounds of supplies delivered to the coordinates I'd been given, all from different drivers working for different companies over the years. The oldest one I could make out was dated October 30th, 1963. The most recent was from last year, October 30th, 2023. A driver named Jennifer Martinez from a company called Blue Ridge Delivery. All of them were signed with the same flowing cursive. Received by Hartwell family. Carved into the bark above the hollow, in letters that looked like they'd been made with a knife. Someone had scratched a message. "They eat the delivery drivers. The groceries are just bait. Don't go to the cabin. Run." My hands were shaking as I read through the receipts. 60 years of drivers, maybe more, all lured up to Devil's Backbone Ridge on October 30th with the same trick. I was just the latest in a long line of people who thought they were making a simple delivery. "Marcus," the daughter's voice called, and it was much closer now. "We can smell you. You smell like fear and loneliness. Those are our favorite flavors." I could see their lights moving through the trees, but they were moving wrong, gliding instead of bobbing like someone walking would make them. And there were more of them now, maybe 6 or 7 distinct lights spread out in a line. "The others tried to run too," the son said. "But there's only one road down the mountain, and we know it better than you do." I realized they were hurting me, driving me away from the road and deeper into the wilderness, where no one would ever find me. But I also realized something else. They were taking their time, enjoying the hunt. Whatever they weren't in a hurry to catch me. I started working my way around them, using the thick forest as cover and trying to circle back toward where I'd left my truck. I moved slowly, testing each step before putting my weight down, stopping frequently to listen. The voices kept calling to me, but they stayed roughly in the same area, like they expected me to keep running in a straight line. It took me almost 2 hours to get back to the clearing where my truck sat dead and useless. The cabin was still there, still glowing with that warm light, but now I could see it properly. The logs were rotted and covered in moss, the windows were broken and patched with what looked like animal skins, and the smoke coming from the chimney was the wrong color, too thick and too dark. But the worst part was the smell. Not the cooking food I'd smelled before, but something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I tried my truck one more time, hoping against hope that whatever had drained it might have worn off. The key turned, the engine coughed once, and for a moment I thought I was saved. Then it died again, and this time smoke started rising from under the hood. That's when I heard them coming back, calling my name in voices that were starting to sound less human and more like recordings of human voices played through broken speakers. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from my truck's glove compartment, the one thing that didn't seem to be affected by whatever was killing the electronics, and ran into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing. If I couldn't drive down, maybe I could find another way off the mountain. The forest was a maze of deadfalls and rocky outcroppings, but I kept moving, following what I hoped was a downward slope. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, no longer trying to be quiet or subtle. They were done playing games. "Marcus," the father's voice called, but it was distorted now, like it was coming through. "Water. You can't leave without having dinner with us. It's rude." I fired the flare gun into the air, hoping someone might see it, but all it did was briefly illuminate the canopy above me and confirm that I was completely alone up there. The red light faded quickly, leaving me in darkness deeper than before. I kept moving, stumbling over roots and rocks, until I found what felt like an old trail or deer path. It was heading downhill, and I followed it as fast as I dared, using my hands to feel my way in the darkness. That's when I heard the most terrifying sound of all. Complete silence. The voices had stopped calling. The crashing through the forest had stopped. Even the normal night sounds that should have been there, owls, insects, small animals moving through the leaves, were gone. I stopped and listened, straining to hear anything that might tell me where they were or what they were doing. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing coming from directly behind me. I turned around and saw the mother standing about 10 feet away, but she wasn't the same woman I'd seen through the cabin window. She was tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin in a way that looked like someone had stretched her on a rack. Her arms hung down to her knees, and her fingers were too long and had too many joints. Her smile was the same, but in the darkness it looked like a wound cut across her face. "There you are," she said, and her voice was like wind through a broken pipe. "We've been looking everywhere for you." I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush without caring about the noise anymore. Behind me, I could hear her following, but she wasn't running. She was walking, taking her time like she knew I couldn't get away. The trail led to a rocky outcropping that dropped off into darkness. I could hear water running somewhere below, maybe a stream that would lead down the mountain, but I couldn't see how far the drop was or what was at the bottom. "Marcus," the mother's voice called, and she was close enough that I could hear her breathing. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We promise it won't hurt for long." I looked back and saw her walking slowly toward me, her two long arms swaying at her sides and her head tilted at that impossible angle. Behind her, I could see the others emerging from the trees. The father with his face stretched too wide, the children with their backward-bending necks, and several others I hadn't seen before. Men and women in clothes from different decades, all walking with that same measured pace, all wearing that same terrible smile. 60 years, the father said. 60 years we've been calling drivers up this mountain, and they all taste the same: fear and regret, and the bitter knowledge that no one will ever find them. I realized I had two choices: jump into the darkness and hope for the best, or let them catch me and become the next name carved into a tree somewhere. I chose the darkness. The fall was longer than I expected, and I hit the stream hard enough to knock the wind out of me. The water was ice cold and moving fast, and for a few seconds I thought I was going to drown. But it carried me downstream, away from the ridge and whatever was up there, bouncing me off rocks and tree roots until I managed to grab onto a fallen branch and pull myself to shore. I was bruised and soaked and probably hypothermic, but I was alive and away from them. I followed the stream downhill for what felt like hours, until I finally saw lights in the distance. Real lights, from a farmhouse with trucks in the yard and dogs barking when they heard me coming. The farmer who found me said I looked like I'd been mauled by a bear and left for dead. He drove me to the hospital in his pickup, and I spent 2 days recovering from hypothermia and exhaustion. When the sheriff came to take my statement, I told him I'd gotten lost in the woods and fallen into the stream, which was mostly true. I never told anyone about the cabin or the family or the receipts I'd found in the tree. Who would believe me? Even now, writing this down, it sounds like something I dreamed while delirious from the cold. But I know it was real. I quit the delivery job as soon as I got out of the hospital and moved to Charleston, where there are streetlights and neighbors and the sound of traffic at all hours. I work in an office now, doing data entry for an insurance company. It's boring, but boring feels safe. Sarah from Mountain Fresh called me a few weeks later to ask if I knew anything about the Hartwell delivery. According to her records, no one had ever placed an order under that name, and there was no envelope of cash in the office. The GPS coordinates I'd been given led to a section of national forest that had been closed to the public for 40 years due to unstable terrain. I researched the area when I felt strong enough to face it. Devil's Backbone Ridge was the site of a mining accident in 1962 that killed 16 workers. Their bodies were never recovered. The mining company built houses for the families up there, but after the accident, everyone moved away. The houses were eventually abandoned and burned down to prevent squatters. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. I found newspaper articles about missing delivery drivers going back to the 1,960 seconds. Different companies, different people, but always the same pattern. Last seen making a delivery to remote areas of the mountains. Vehicles found abandoned on logging roads or never found at all. Bodies never recovered. The most recent article was from 6 months ago. Jennifer Martinez, 28, Blue Ridge delivery. Last seen on October 30th, 2023, making a delivery to an address in the Devil's Backbone Ridge area. Her truck was found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine, but there was no sign of Jennifer or the groceries she'd been delivering. I tried to contact her family to tell them what I knew, but what could I say? That their daughter was killed by something pretending to be the Hartwell family? That she's probably buried somewhere up on that ridge with 60 years worth of other drivers? Instead, I created this account and wrote down everything that happened as clearly and honestly as I can remember it. If you work for a delivery company and someone asks you to take groceries up to Devil's Backbone Ridge, don't go. If you get GPS coordinates instead of a real address, don't go. If they specifically request you by name without knowing who you are, definitely don't go. And if you're reading this and you know someone who disappeared making deliveries in the Appalachian Mountains, especially around Halloween, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't save Jennifer Martinez, and I'm sorry I can't prove what happened to any of them. But I know they're still up there, waiting for the next driver who's willing to make one last delivery before dark. The Hartwell family is always hungry, and they're very, very patient. Last week, I got a grocery store circular in my mail, addressed to Marcus, Devil's Backbone Ridge, with no return address. The items circled in red pen were canned goods, flour, rice, and other non-perishables. 50 pounds worth, exactly. I burned it, but I kept the ashes. I don't know why. I think they're calling me back.